Shabbat Saturday morning, we have services followed by a Kiddush. Okay. Anybody by profession, psychologist or therapist? Okay. Which?
Clinical social work.
Clinical social work. Okay. So you'll help us out a little. So let me make a disclaimer. I'm not, of course, in rabbinic capacity. You deal with it, and you have some sort of training. But obviously, we're not dealing with clinical issues. Those we refer to the professionals. We're talking about more how do people able to help themselves with different things that come up in life. So what we're going to do today, we're going to focus on grief and mourning a little bit, as much as 45 minutes allows us to go through it. Primarily what I want to do is run through some of the Judaic literature about it, and see what it has to say about it, as well as how actually our rituals accommodate these stages of grief and mourning. But if I could take, I don't know if it's fair or not, to take a few minutes. I'm sure everyone had throughout their life some experience of grief. It could be with the loss of a loved one, grandparent, parents, some people, unfortunately, children, spouses. That's the loss of somebody. But then you have the loss of relationships. You have the loss of dreams that we have, jobs, in some way or another. I think it's fair to say that everybody experiences grief differently. Although there are certain general stages that are, based on research, most people go through them, but even those stages, how each person experiences them is going to be extremely unique. So before we start, if anybody feels comfortable sharing how they experienced, if they experience, or how they observe someone experience, and really primarily of how they were able to work through it. What specific skills or tools, or whether it's behavioral or cognitive or ideas, or that help them through periods of grief. So if anybody would feel comfortable sharing, they say somebody once came to the rabbi. We don't have confession booths in Judaism, but still people feel guilty, right? Jewish guilty, feel guilty, uncomfortable. So you do come, asking, what do I do to atone, to repair, and so on. But he was embarrassed to tell the rabbi what he did. So he comes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I have a friend who's embarrassed to come tell you his sins, so he asked me to come on your behalf. And the rabbi smiles and says, well, your friend could have came himself and said that he had a friend. So you can share it on behalf of a friend. Anybody? Yeah.
Well, it's after living with my wife for 70 years, roughly the same age. About 2 or 3 years ago, she got a
Can you speak up, sir? If possible.
I'm sorry.
If possible.
Part of
If possible.
bring her, allow her to first bring up, but she still had a very good background and mind, so it was a slow digression. Luckily for me, she was not in pain or any discomfort. So it took about 2.5 years to slowly have her fade away, and then when she died, I was able to be with her at a hospital in Annapolis, allowed a certain room we could stay all night. And she held my hands in the last minute, and I'm still debating this. I thought I heard her say, goodbye, darling, and that was it. Did I hear her say it? I don't know. But I wanted her to say it. So that's always a slight puzzle to me, that she actually said it, but there was no one else in my daughter. They did not hear her. They're not close enough. And it's been 4 months now, so it's slowly getting back to something.
When people are very close, they don't always have to say it verbally.
Pardon?
So when people are very close, they can say things without having to say them.
Yes.
And you can get the message without having to hear it. Well, first of all, I want to say the traditional comfort that we say in Judaism. You said this is something recent. We say, "Hamakom yenachem etchem," God should comfort you, b'toch shar avei Tzion b'Yerushalayim, amongst all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Yeah.
Well, I think many people here know that 2 years ago, we lost our beloved organist, Jared.
In a tragic way.
Tragic, tragic, tragic. Well, the interesting thing was, it was after the season, and I was at the memorial service after the season. The amp was full. It was really incredible. He was much beloved. But yesterday, there was a presentation in one of the denominational houses, and people were talking about him. And I said a few things. One man stood up, tears, and he said, "Well, it was instantaneous. Jared did not feel anything. He went right away." And I'm trying to adjust. Well, the good news is that the new young organist who first heard Jared when he was 10 years old, it was 25 years ago, and now he's got permanent organist. And so it's a kind of immortality. And I'm kind of adjusting. Instead of seeing the white hair for so many years, I'm seeing red hair of the new organist. But he's very good, and Jared will live on in that way. And I think we feel that way often with people that we have known and loved. That in a way, they live on.
Okay. Anybody else?
I recently had a sister-in-law pass away. Somebody had told me prior, grief comes much like the waves that happen when a rock is dropped in a still pond. There's a big burst wave, and a later wave that's a little less, and a later wave that's a little less. Waves keep going. After saying in my religion, after hardship, ease will change over time. I will say that experience was, that prediction was true, that grief would come large and then less and less each time that next wave came.
Is there anything particular that you do to ease that, or is it just a natural phenomenon?
In our tradition, we're asked to be real with our feelings with ourselves and be honest with our feelings, and to not promote excessive blubbering, excessive wailing. Crying is a part of grief. Trying not to overdo it, like show of it. It's always been healthy advice and experience for myself. Honestly, feel the feelings and not be afraid of the feelings. Move through the feelings without excess.
Okay. Elaine, you want to say something? You raise your hand.
Yeah, I lost 2 friends in the last couple of years, and I kept on wanting to go every day to visit them for Shiva. I just wanted to participate. I didn't want to say goodbye. One I couldn't. I mean, one I wasn't that close to for many years, because she was sort of in a coma for about 10 years. So and they came in from Israel, and I couldn't visit more than once. That wouldn't have been appropriate. But another one I visited 3 nights because I just missed her. I just wanted to keep on going to be with them.
So let me just go through some of the sources. And then as we'll go through the sources, we'll try to give some explanation that would give us a theme of how Judaism views of how to experience grief and how to deal with grief. And if you can even say overcome, at least to a livable point of overcoming grief. So if you have the source sheet, everyone has a source sheet, yeah? We find experiences as grief in scripture, all the way from the beginning of Genesis. Number 1, and Sarah died, and Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her. We find then in number 2, which is later in Genesis, and Isaac brought her, this is talking about Rebekah, he brought her to the tent of Sarah, his mother, and he took Rebekah and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted for the loss of his mother. So interesting, entering into a new relationship offered him some form of comfort. Later we find the famous story of Joseph and his brothers. When Jacob hears the news, number 3 on the sheet, Jacob tore his clothes. He put sackcloth on his loins and mourned his son for many days. All his sons and daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, "No, I will go down to my son in mourning to the grave." And this went on, how many years were they separated until finally they were reunited? Anybody knows? Huh?
Exactly.
22 years. 22 years. So for 22 years he was mourning, which is talking about excessive. That's excessive. But that's interesting because, and the reason I bring it up is because the Talmud, which is explaining scripture, explains that naturally a person does accept comfort after a period of time. We'll talk about that period of time in a minute. And therefore the question, why did Jacob not accept comfort? Okay, it was a child that he loved so closely and it was a special child. 22 years, I mean, you have another 11 sons and a daughter, grandchildren, and a life, and yet he was stuck in that state of grief. And the answer of the Talmud I find fascinating. The Talmud says the reason why the grief went on was because Joseph was actually alive. There's an intuition. When a person is actually dead, we come to terms with it eventually, and therefore we allow ourselves to be comforted and then carry on their life or their legacy or whatever it is, and connect to them through that way. But when the person is alive, intuitively, we don't allow ourselves to be comforted because they're alive. It's still, we're not severing that relation. We're not putting an end to it. And therefore, he didn't accept the comfort, and he was grieving for that period of time. Number 4 is when Aaron passes away, the whole congregation saw that Aaron has expired, and the entire house of Israel wept for Aaron for 30 days. Later we find at the end of Deuteronomy when Moses passes away, and the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days, and the days of weeping over mourning for Moses came to an end. So we see this long period of 30 days. So let me run through some of the rituals first that we go through. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and explain a little bit the psychology behind this, because it's really the rituals that we go through after a person passes, a loved one passes, is really one, to honor the dead, but at the same time to allow the living to heal. And so it's really a double process occurring at the same time. So I just quoted some of them. We'll go back to some others later. But if we look at number 8 on the sheet, The first thing we do when we get the bad news, when we experience the bad news, is what's called kriya. Anybody know what kriya means? Tearing, which we tear the garment. Really, it's supposed to be done at the moment that either you're there when the person dies, or if you heard the news. Today, for practical reasons, it's done at the funeral home. For a variety of reasons why it's done that, but really it should be done immediately. Okay? Now, there's a new custom, which is a new modern commercialized a custom that was invented by the funeral homes, which is to put on a black ribbon.
Yeah.
Why? I don't know. They don't want to ruin the clothing, whatever the reason should be. But actually, as we'll see soon, the reason for the kriya, by putting on the ribbon as opposed to actually ripping the garment, you're actually preventing the person a very important part of the grieving process. It's not just an expression of the grievance, but it's actually part of it. It's part of it itself. So number 8, Maimonides lays out, a mourner is obligated to rend his garments for his dead. As can be derived from Leviticus, do not rend your garments lest you die. Now this is speaking about to the high priest. The high priest used to wear special garments in the temple, and he wasn't allowed to rip those garments, even if a loved one passes away. So therefore the text says that even if a loved one passes away, you in the temple are not allowed to perform this kriya. You're not allowed to rip the garments. So from that we understand that everybody else, from the fact that you're prohibiting it for him, everybody else is meant to rip the garments. Implied is that others must rend the garments. Number 9, we teach a person that he should not recklessly destroy property and throw it to oblivion. It is better to give it to the poor than to throw it to maggots and worms. Whoever casts many articles on a deceased person violates the commandment against destroying property. So why am I quoting this? What does this mean, first of all, and why am I quoting it? What Maimonides is saying, which is based on the Talmud, is that in a person's, one of the experiences that a person experiences in grief is anger, sometimes rage, but some negative passion. And sometimes they don't even know who to express it to. It's just they're feeling this extreme pain and it expresses itself in this rage, and they don't know how to express it. And so what do people sometimes do, even in good situations, when you're angry? You throw things, right? Unjust, we're not getting into the right or wrong, but that's what you do. And so in this rage of grief, if you can say, a person might just begin to throw things and, and so Jewish law says you're not allowed to waste. You're not allowed to just waste things. You're not allowed to just throw them, waste them, break them, and so on. It's a biblical prohibition. And yet, that's number 9. But number 8 says you should rip your garments, which is, okay, you're not throwing it in rage, but you're also ultimately, maybe you can then later sew it back together, but ultimately it's a form of destruction. So what you see here is a balance, that there is a feeling that should be acknowledged and should be acted on by ripping the garments. But as you said earlier, it has to be balanced. It has to be controlled, if you want. So you're allowing the expression of the feeling, but at the same time, you're not allowing excessive. So you rip the garment, enough. Now you don't have to go destroy every other garment in the house. You don't have to go throw it and so on. So what does Kriya really accomplish? What does it really accomplish? Well, first, like I mentioned, it allows you to express the pain in that rip. That rip you have to actually do by hand. There's a difference between the parent and the rest of the family, right or left side, but usually you do it at the top of the garment, so it's visible, it's next to the heart. So you're ripping the garment. It's really allowing yourself to physically express that anger or pain or grief in a physical way. So even if you have, that's not a time really to talk. It's not a time to really engage, but the physical activity does that. The second thing it accomplishes in the process of grief is that it makes this finality real. Because part of the process is, the first part of the process is really shock and denial. That's, the different publications have different terminologies that they use for it, but that's really the initial stage. Now, if you see someone going through a long period of slowly dying, if you want to call it that, then the grieving process starts earlier, from when you predict that it's heading in that direction. And even then, sometimes you think, well, I had a longer period to prepare myself, to slowly grieve, and so it's not shocking anymore. And yet we find that at times we're not prepared. Even then, we're not prepared because ultimately we were close to the people and they're not here. They're not available. Physically, they're not with us. And so the rip, in addition to it, a lot expressing your feelings, is also really bringing to the forefront the reality of what happens, that it's real. And that's important for later, for acceptance and comfort and so on. It's important to accept it. But the third reason why we do the Kriya, and this is important, and again, we're going to go back and forth because I'm going through the rituals, but really the stages of experience are a little bit different. But the third is, I think, an important thing. What do we do when we rip the garments? We expose the body, we expose the hearts. And really what we're telling the mourner, and really we're telling ourselves that we are the mourners, that just like we have the clothing that encloses the body, and then you have the body. And so even if you rip the clothing, the body is still intact. And the same is with the human being. We have the soul and we have the clothing of the soul, which is the physical body. And so death is a rip in the body. It's the body that's affected by death. But the soul that's being enclosed by the body is intact. And as we'll see soon, this is a very powerful comfort to know two things, that the person still lives on for eternity, their soul still lives on. It's finality in body, but not finality in soul. And as we'll see later, the second part is that soul not only for itself lives on and is in a better place, but that soul still maintains a connection with us. So if yes, we've severed the physical connection, in other words, you can't give them a hug anymore, physical hug and so on, but you haven't severed the connection. Think about it. The real connection that we have to people, although it's expressed in a physical way, touch and feel and kiss and so on, but really you're connecting to the person. The person is not their body. The person is their personality, their soul. And that relationship, which is the main part of the relationship, carries on because the soul carries on and the soul still maintains a connection with us. And as we'll see later, actually, the soul, one of the parts of grieving is that you feel you can't move on. How can I live life when the person that I loved is not here? Or definitely it was a younger person, and a tragic thing. Definitely if they went through not definitely, different people experience differently, but if it was a long period of illness, or sometimes it was a tragedy, like what happened in Florida now with the collapse of the condominium. So you think it's hard to live life feeling guilty, really. How could I enjoy life knowing that such a negative calamity happened? But in Judaism, the soul, when it moves on, actually wants the family, the close ones, to be happy. And because it maintains a connection through the soul, when it sees that the family is unhappy, it causes pain to the soul, that I am the cause for their unhappiness. So actually, when we recognize that, so if we really love the person, if we're really connected, and we really care about them, then we should be happy. We should live on. We should move on. Because that's really what they want. That makes not just us happy, but actually makes them happy. And that's why also in Judaism, and I'm jumping now a second, we have the Yortzites, which is the yearly anniversary where we go to the cemetery, we say prayers, because that's how we maintain, one of the ways to maintain connection to the soul is through where the body is interred in the cemetery. So that's the first thing we do, is Kriya. So these three things it accomplishes. It allows expression of our grief, a sense of finality, and also it serves as a metaphor for what actually is happening to the deceased, and in some way it's comfort. The next thing that we do, and this is very important, whether someone that's at the moment of death or at the funeral, or if you missed it later going to the gravesite, is asking forgiveness, called mechila, asking for forgiveness. If you handle the dead, of course, you ask for forgiveness that you didn't shame them or you didn't do anything wrong to them. But really, even if you didn't handle the dead, if you had some even remote relationship in your life with the deceased, you should ask for forgiveness. And now that they're in a truer world, in a divine reality, they will forgive you. All their selfishness, if they had, or all their hurt, they're in a different reality, they'll forgive you. Why is this so important? Because one of the stages of grief is guilt. And guilt in many ways. Guilt could be, if you had an argument the night before, which is normal, but all of a sudden you didn't have an opportunity. If you had a difficult relationship in general, still you feel, now that it's moved on and you're able to reflect differently, maybe more objectively in a way. There are feelings of guilt sometimes. Sometimes it's guilt like I could have done more, I should have done more. Why wasn't I available? Why did I allow them to? Whatever, many people, again, experience it in many, many different ways, as grief is experienced in many different ways. So it's very important as the process of mourning and going through grief and allowing yourselves to heal, to ask for forgiveness. Not just to forgive ourselves, but really the knowledge that they are going to forgive us. And actually, in Jewish law, if you shamed someone in public, you have to really ask them for forgiveness in public. What do you do if the person died? So you're supposed to take a quorum of 10 people, so that's considered public, to their gravesite and ask publicly for forgiveness. So that's why this stage of asking for forgiveness at the funeral is a very important thing. It's quietly, you don't have to, unless you shame them publicly, but generally just quietly, you ask them you're forgiving them, so there's no guilt in that way that you're harboring any grudges, and asking them to forgive you. Now, in the process of mourning, in Judaism, there are 5 stages. Whether they relate to the 5 stages psychologically of the mourning, which is what we mentioned, shock and denial, anger, guilt, eventually acceptance. So again, there's different ways people frame it, but it's a process that, by the way, everybody goes through. So when a person feels all of a sudden rage, that's normal. That's a natural feeling that we experience because we lost somebody so dear to us. And anger is a natural feeling. And sometimes the anger could express itself in a religious way. We begin to question our religion. We begin to question, where is God? And it's okay. It's okay to because at that point, that's part of the natural experience. Allow it to pass. Allow yourself to confront it, to experience it, to feel it. Don't feel guilty that you're guilty. Don't feel guilty that you're experiencing that. And that's one of the ways that you're going to allow yourself to heal. So what are the 5 stages of mourning in Judaism? The first is what's called onen. The person is called an onen, or the period is called aminut, which is really the first 24 hours. Or you can say it loosely. I mean, today we bury the dead sometimes a little bit later for a variety of reasons. But really, until you bury the dead, or even that same day, the first day and night, so to speak, until the dead is buried. And that period, you're actually exempted from any ritual, from any religious duties. Why? Because first of all, you're occupied now with something more important, to make sure that the dead is taken care of and buried and so on, but also psychologically. Psychologically, Judaism recognizes that it's impossible to be, I don't mean to say it in a wrong way, to be in your right mind. It's just impossible. You're going through a shocking experience that's so confusing and so overwhelming, and therefore you cannot be held responsible. You cannot have any responsibilities at that time, and therefore you're actually exempt. So you don't have to pray. You don't have to put on the tefillin for a man, and so on. All those things you're exempted from. But once you bury the dead, and in that itself, again, there's also processes of mourning. For example, when you lower the casket into the grave, then you shovel in the dirt. And it's actually a mitzvah for everybody present to partake in that, besides for the children. Children are not that because it shows disrespect to their parents, but everybody else, it's actually a mitzvah to partake in that. There are different customs in that, not to hand the shovel to somebody else. You don't want to indicate that you're sort of supporting, whatever, but generally it's a mitzvah. And again, it brings a sense of finality. Some people even want to say just hearing the earth, the thud, brings home this reality of takes us out of a state of denial and brings us to face the reality that we're facing. So you come home. At the cemetery, there was also some comfort, but you come home and you're not supposed to really prepare your own food. A meal is supposed to be prepared by your neighbors, by community. They bring you a meal, and there are certain rituals in that meal itself. For example, to eat an egg and to eat a round bagel or something round. And again, the idea behind that is to bring out the idea of the cycle of life. And so that this is part of the cycle. It's not unique to your experience. Every human being goes through the cycle. And part of the cycle is that we end, but we also then begin anew. And so we bring it through ritual, this message, without saying anything, but this idea of the cycle of life. And then we begin a period of Shiva. Shiva, actually, what does Shiva mean, by the way? Sitting, right? That's what really means 7. So it depends how you spell the word Shiva. It could be Shiva or Shiv'ah, which would mean either 7 or sitting. But really it's 7. Why 7? Because it's a 7-day mourning period that's mandated. Mandated not to leave the home, to stay home, preferably in the home of the deceased, if that's possible, with all family members sitting together, and to experience the grief for 7 days. No work, nothing. You're home, in the home of the deceased, with friends and family. And it's important to observe the entire week. Why? Because again, it's the acknowledgement in Judaism that grief is not a 24-hour period. It's not, okay, we had the funeral, we sat down, and now I'm back to work. You're not allowing yourself to really grieve. You're not allowing yourself to experience it. So Judaism says, we're going to force you into the home. You have to stay home for a whole week. You have to experience grief. Do not be distracted by life. Do not be distracted by business. Do not be distracted by other duties and responsibilities. Focus on what just happened for almost 7 full days. There are exclusions to that. If holidays fall out of middle, they cut it short, but generally 7 full days. And these 7 days are divided into 2 parts. And this is important, by the way, when you're going to a Shiva call. Really, in Judaism, the first 3 days are days for crying. The first 3 of the 7. Days to just cry. And it's really not a time to pay a Shiva call. Now, I know we do that anyways for a variety of reasons, But really, again, if you look at it from a psychological perspective, they're not ready. They are not ready to bring others into their life yet. Forget about they're not ready to talk about it. It's a period of 72 hours after the dead is buried. It starts after that they need to cry. They need to grieve. They need to express through, without words, but just through the sitting and the crying, those feelings. The next 4 days, those are the days that the community should come and pay the shivukah, the last 4 days. And even there are many laws. You're not supposed to begin the conversation. You have to wait for the mourner to begin. Maybe they're not comfortable. So you don't come in, you don't say shalom. You don't say peace. This is not a time to say peace. It's a hard time for them. If they want to open and say peace to you, that's fine. But you have to allow them their space. They have to begin the conversation. It's not a time to, joke and happy. If they want to do that, that's fine. That's their way of expressing their grief. But you're just there to be with them. Just to be with them. Now, you can encourage them to talk about it, usually it's done through talking about the person that passed. You allow them to talk about their life, their virtues, their relationship, their accomplishments, by focusing on the person and what they've accomplished and what they've achieved and the relationships, that allows them to express their grief without talking about the grief. Sometimes people don't have the right words or are not ready to talk about it, but just by talking about the person in a past tense is, again, a way to allow them to experience the grief. After the 7-day period starts a 30-day period. The first 7 days, what does grief express itself in? You're not allowed to shower. You're not allowed to put on new clothing. You have to sit in the torn clothing that you ripped at the funeral, and so on. These all things that you're in a state of mourning. You're in a state of. But then the next 30 days, it becomes less. So the next 30 days are going to be certain restrictions. For example, you're not allowed to buy new clothing. You shouldn't take a haircut. You shouldn't join joyous occasions like weddings. You shouldn't listen to music. So it's not crying and being secluded and grieving. Now you can go back to work and you can go back to real life. You're allowing yourself that. But at the same time, you're still not over it. You're still allowing yourself. And again, it's a double purpose. One is to honor the dead, that we didn't forget about you. But also it's about allowing yourself the reality to set in, the feelings to express themselves by not allowing yourself to be joyous, really. And if it's a parent-child relationship, then it goes for 12 months. For the full 12 months, that you don't join in joyous occasions. What's interesting is you don't take a haircut, again, to show a sense of like, until people start telling you, your hair's too long. So then you're allowed, sort of. You don't want to be abnormal. You don't want to stand out, but at the same time, you want to allow yourself to go through these periods. So this is allowing yourself to grieve and the stages that we go through. But what's most important really to allow ourselves to heal is, and let me share a story that I mentioned to some of you in the past that brings out this point in a certain way. It was after the Holocaust that somebody came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and suggested to remember the 6 million that were killed in the Holocaust. Maybe at every Passover Seder table, there should be an empty chair. And this way, you remember that some of us are missing. And the Rebbe said, no, I agree there should be a chair, but not an empty chair. Invite somebody that otherwise would not be at the Seder to join the Seder. In other words, the way we mourn, and really the way we are comforted, is not by focusing so much on the emptiness, on the void that it caused, but how are we going to fill that void? What are we going to do positive in memory of, for the sake of those that we love? And that becomes a very important part in Jewish ritual, to really do something active, do something positive, add more lights as a result of the negative experience. And it's not just honoring those that passed, but really it enables us to heal from this grieving point, from this grieving experience, because we're able to translate and really transform that feeling into something positive. So we're not abandoning our loved one, we're not forgetting about our loved one, which is usually the feeling that how can I forget and leave them? I'm living with them in the present, in the life that I am living, in the life that I am encouraging, in the life that I'm creating for others, and so on. So this lives on. So it's very important. That's why in Judaism, it's very important to really create memories. It's not just about creating, plaques on the walls. It's really about, in their merit, these things continue to happen. And another fascinating point is that really, when we're in this world, with all the challenges that we face, we have an opportunity that in the next world they don't have. And that is to do a mitzvah. So we have opportunities that they don't have. They're now reaping the reward of their life's accomplishment. But whatever they accomplish, that's it. More they can't go. We, on the other hand, we're still here. We can do more mitzvah. We can do more positive. We can continuously grow. And so when we do something in memory of those that passed on, we're giving them opportunities to do more mitzvot. So even though they're not doing it, but because we're doing it on their behalf, they are the cause of it. So then they continue to go higher and higher in their spiritual experiences, in their paradise they're experiencing. So that's why it's very important to do mitzvot on behalf of those that we love. So let me go through some points. We're getting to late, so I just want to go through some points that it's important to understand what we feel or people feel, and therefore what really we need. The customary phrase that we tell mourners before we leave the Shiva house is, as I mentioned earlier, Hamakom. It's on the sheet, I think I put it. Hamakom Yenachem Etchem, God. It's number 18 on the sheet. Hamakom Yenachem Etchem betoch sha'ar avelit Zion b'Yerushalayim, which means may God comfort you together with all mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. What kind of comfort is this? What is this saying to the mourner? So the feeling that mourners have, and really any person that's experiencing some type of hardship in life, it doesn't have to be something as extreme as losing a loved one, but even going through an illness or someone that they love is going through or any type of hardship, is really a sense of loneliness. That nobody knows what I'm going through. Nobody feels what I'm feeling. And in a certain way, if you want to exaggerate it, but there's a certain truth to it. People come to the Shiva house, they'll comfort those that are mourning, and then they'll move on. And yet those that are mourning are still sitting at the Shiva house. So there's a certain sense of loneliness. And that's, it's hard to say if that's the most difficult part, but that's a very difficult part of the grieving process. And so when we come to the mourner, we remind them that you're actually part of a community. You're actually part of a religion. You're part of a nation. You're part of something larger, and we're all together in this. And so therefore, may God comfort you amongst all the comfort, all those that are mourning Zion and Jerusalem. And there is a collective experience, and your individual experience is part of that. And therefore, you're not alone. We're here together with you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it actually offers words of comfort, not just loneliness, to those that are mourning. Because in this phrase, there are three messages. Three messages in this phrase. One is that we believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's the 13th principle of faith in Judaism. And so therefore, what you're telling them, just like we believe we'll come back to Zion and Jerusalem, even though we're in exile, But the same as with the loss of the loved one, that it's temporary, and there'll be a period later on that we will see each other together. So that's number one. Number two is, and this is very important, and this goes back to what we mentioned about the Kriya. The destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, was a destruction of stones, of the building. But according to Judaism, the holiness is still at that site. So when we talk about the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, we're talking about, what are we mourning? The destruction of the physical edifice. But the holiness, the spirituality of the space is still intact, right? That's why we go to the Western Wall, and that's why we... So what we're telling them, we're comforting amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, is the same in your experience. It's the destruction, the loss of the physical, but the spiritual, the soul is still intact, is still whole, is still here. And the third point is that actually, how do you say passed on, someone that passes on in Hebrew? So there are many words that are used, niftar, but really the term that's used many times is histalek or nistalek, which literally means, what does it mean, stalek? Left. Literally, I mean, that's what left. But really, histalkut also means elevated. So really, when we're saying a person passed, what we're really saying is they were actually elevated. They didn't disappear, but they were elevated. They're on a higher plane now. Somebody once wrote to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he lost, a very sad story. They lost their son in a tragic accident, and they were grieving. I mean, you can just imagine of how parents are grieving losing a child. And one of the things the Rebbe told them, he told them like this. He told them this idea that the soul really doesn't disappear, but it's now elevated. It moves, it's there, but on a higher plane. The Rebbe said, imagine you had the same child, and the child went overseas. Now think of overseas, not like today we have planes, it's easy to go, they communicate, but think of it like in going back, millennia, where overseas meant basically you're not going to see them again. They went far, far away. But you know that they're there, you know that they're comfortable, you know that they're happy. Are you going to grieve? Are you going to be angry? No. Are you upset that they're not with you? Yes. Would you like to be with them? Yes. But you're not grieving, right? Now imagine to yourself, take it a step further, the Rebbe said, that you're able to send them packages, care packages. Would you send that? Of course. So the Rebbe said that's the exact experience. The soul went overseas, went to a different reality, but it is there. So yes, is it painful that we don't see them? We can't communicate with them? Yes. But you know that they're in a place that they are comfortable and happy. And you can send them care packages. You can do something in their memory. You can do a mitzvah for them. And they benefit from it. And so when we bring this idea into our awareness, when we're aware of this, it's a very powerful comfort. And then I'll finish with one more thing, and then if you have any questions. I mean, there's a lot to talk about this, but the first thing we say actually when we hear that somebody passes on, and then we repeat this again at length at the funeral, is that we say a blessing actually. You hear negative news, you say, "Blessed you, O Lord, Dayan Haemet, the judge of truth." And then at the funeral we say, "Hashem Natan, Vashem Lakach, Hashem Yiten, Oz Lamo Yiten." God should give the strength. So what do we say? God has given life, God has taken life. In other words, it's a recognition that whatever happens didn't happen. God is the one that made it happen. Now, we don't understand why God makes things happen, but just the awareness that whatever happens is really coming from God. It's not an accident. It didn't just happen. Takes away for the death this is what was meant to happen to this person, why we don't always understand. But this was what meant, it takes away a lot of sense of guilt, a lot of sense of anger at people. Again, it doesn't mean that if a person did a wrong choice and murdered somebody, whether advertently or inadvertently, of course they have to suffer the consequence for the choices. But to the person, to the deceased, this is what God planned. This is God has given life and God has taken. And therefore, this is we say, blessed you God, the judge of truth. This is your judgment. And we repeat this several times throughout the process. And this is part of that comfort, to recognize, A, that we're not alone. God is part of this process. B, that it's not just a freak of nature or an accident or somebody's wrong choices, but this was part of the plan. And the Talmud actually tells us, the Midrash actually tells a very fascinating story. That there was a sage that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lost one of his children. One of the great Talmudic sages lost one, and then the rabbis came to comfort him, and each one presented him with another idea that felt that that would be a comfort. So the first student said, well, Adam lost the son too. I mean, Cain killed Abel, right? And yet he found consolation. So you should also allow yourself to be comforted. He said, that didn't help me too much, right? So the next rabbi turns and said, well, Job had sons and daughters. We know the story of Job. He lost them. And yes, and yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should allow yourself to be consoled. So again, he said, you haven't really helped anything. You just added sorrow to my sorrow. You found me another person that's experiencing the grief, but you haven't actually helped me. And this went on, each one trying, thinking that they're offering another example of scripture. And then finally, one of the students says to him, Rabbi, let me tell you something. Allow me to tell you a story. And he tells them the following. He says, there was once a king that entrusted a citizen with a very expensive diamond, a very expensive gem. And this citizen was now anxious to make sure to protect it, to secure it, to make sure that it doesn't get damaged or doesn't get scratched, and that it remains intact. So when the king comes back, when the king finally came back and they returned the gem intact, there's a sense of relief. God has given you a gem, he tells his rabbi. Give me this child. And now God said, I want it back. You should be comforted that you gave God back the child the same way, or maybe even better than the way God gave it to you. And he tells the students, you are comforted. And we find a similar story, for those who are familiar with Talmudic figures. There was a great woman by the name of Bruria. Anybody familiar with Bruria? If not, you should look it up. Yeah. She was probably the first, I don't say the first, but in Talmudic time, the feminist of the time. And her husband was a great rabbi, Rabbi Meir. Well, she comes home one day and she checks on her children, and 2 children are dead. Why? I don't know why. Maybe smoking away, whatever the reason. It doesn't say what the reason, but 2 children. You can imagine a mother seeing 2 children dead. But she knew her husband's going to come home. So before her husband comes home, what are you going to tell your husband? So she waits outside and she says, when he comes, he says, Rameir, I have a halachic question for you. What's the halachic question? The halachic question is that a while ago, somebody entrusted me with a gem to safeguard. And they came back and they want it back. Should I give it back or keep it? He says, what do you mean? If they entrusted you, of course you should give it back. He says, okay, come with me. Let me show you the 2 gems that I'm giving back. So again, this idea, it's a very difficult thing and we should never have to experience, but the idea that it's all by divine plan. God gave, God took, and we can feel comforted that we did everything in our capability, that while we were entrusted, while we did have those relationships, we did the best of our capabilities, and therefore when God came and took it back, by his choice, not by our choice, not by any sense of guilt or responsibility on our part, but at least we had the best relationship, or we had the best parenting, or best parents, or and then that serves as a comfort. The reason I mentioned this also today, why we're talking about this today, so as I mentioned, the statement that we tell the mourners is that God should comfort you among all the mourners of Zion, Jerusalem, which actually in the Jewish calendar, this is a 3-week period that we actually mourn the destruction of the first and second temple. There's going to be a fast day on Sunday, which is the Tisha B'Av fast. So it's actually, I felt it's apropos to talk about this subject, even though it's a little bit of a heavy subject to talk about, but this is a period that we should experience with regard on a national level, on a historic level, so we'll also apply it on a personal level as well. If anybody wants to add anything or ask anything or say anything.
I'm curious.
Yes.
You spoke about knowing the connection is there still when someone is passed, but say when you lose an unborn child and you haven't felt them, you haven't had that relationship. But obviously they were there, they were part of you, whatever, and whatnot. What's the intuition there? What do you do there? What do you feel there?
There's a book I would recommend. It's called A Time to Heal. It's a little book, Time to Heal, by a rabbi named Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson. I think it's a fascinating book. It's simple read. He doesn't try to make it to that, but it's written in a very personable way, and it offers a lot of insight. Most of it is taken from the insight that he's taken from the Lubavitcher Rebbe and how he responded to people in their situations of loss. But he collected it and organized in a very beautiful way. A Time to Heal. You can actually find it. You can read it online on the Chabad.org. Google A Time to Heal, and you don't have to buy the book if you don't want to. I mean, it's better to buy it. You can read it online. But there he has some things. But let me just say a very general idea. Okay, this will apply to I think miscarriage happens. At least in our community, I mean, we have many children. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. You know, we experienced 2 miscarriages throughout our years of childhood. There's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Hasidic movement, where there were parents that couldn't have children for many, many years, and they asked them for a blessing, and finally he gave them a blessing to have a child. They had a child, and the child died at 2 years old. So it wasn't a miscarriage, child, 2 years. I think it was 2 or 5, a very young age. And they came back crying to the Baal Shem Tov, telling the Baal Shem Tov, we asked for a blessing. You would have told us, look, I can't help you. Okay, so it's devastating, but here you put our hopes high. You gave us the, excitement and exhilaration of having the child for 2 years, and then God takes it away. It makes it even more painful. Why do we have to go through this experience? So I'm not going to go through the whole story, but the Baal Shem Tov basically laid out a whole story about somebody that lived a very virtuous life. But at the beginning of their life, for whatever circumstances, they were not exposed to that virtuous lifestyle, and so they lived a different kind of lifestyle. So when the soul came up to heaven, where a virtuous person goes straight into paradise, goes straight into what we call the Garden of Eden. But because of that period, that they didn't live that virtuous life, therefore, there was a blemish on the soul that needed rectification. So therefore, one of the ways is you give the soul an opportunity either to go through a limited experience of hell, which cleanses the soul, or to come back down into this earth and live a virtuous life. So the soul chose to come back down. And God chose you to be the parents of this soul, to allow the soul this opportunity to rectify itself. So therefore, when the Baal Shem Tov gave them that understanding that it wasn't for nothing that they had the child and the child lived this limited amount of time, it served a purpose, that gave them a sense of comfort. There was a meaning to it. And so what the purpose is, we never know. But what we do know is that even an unborn child has an effect on us, has an effect on those that are aware of it. There's anticipation, and then you start thinking, what kind of life do I want the child to have, and what kind of values? And so sometimes you begin to adjust your own life and so on. So the child had an impact. And again, what the purpose, we don't know, but that impact itself is purposeful. And so you facilitated this soul to have whatever impact they needed to have in order to fulfill whatever purpose they needed to fulfill, without the hardships of child rearing. Yeah.
You know, we talk about closure, just a lot about what you were speaking. But I personally, and I'm sure most other people, probably have never reached closure for lots of certain people from our life. So we deal with it. And I understand the story of Isaac. I didn't know it was 22 years.
Joseph.
Joseph, I'm sorry, yeah, Mourning. But I can understand that very easily because I still feel the emptiness and the lack of closure. Probably will never experience total closure. Not because I didn't have a chance to say goodbye, but just because that person had a significant person almost on a day-to-day basis. So I just think that try to do the best we can to bring closure so that we can move on. But I do think it's possible to move on without actually having.
Yeah, I didn't use the word closure. I used the word acceptance.
Okay.
The word what?
Acceptance.
Yeah.
Yes, there's never closure,
Oh, yeah.
but there's acceptance. You need acceptance to be able to move on. But yes, the person is always going to be missing in your life in a physical way. And whatever impacts they had while they were alive with us, they don't have those impacts anymore. And so, yes, there's always something missing. And there's always going to be times that you'll cry about, which is okay. But the balance is that you can live and move on. When it becomes paralyzing, that's the problem. So that's the balance. And the rituals and the acknowledgement and the expression of it allows us to grieve in a healthy way so that it doesn't paralyze us. We can remember them, miss them, and at the same time be happy and move on and do things for them and so on. Yeah.
The other parts of what you said here in accepting death as exactly how it's worded. But even as I mentioned before, as my wife was slowly fading, we knew that eventually, but there is no such thing as acceptance. Even though I knew it was going to happen, it was still something that I would.
No, not accept. You're talking about acceptance in the future that it's going to happen. I'm talking about after it happens. First of all, you're still within a year.
Yeah.
So you have to. You're not in a point where you're holding at acceptance.
Yeah.
But looking forward, you should know that there'll be a time that'll be easier for you to. But at this time, that's not.
Yeah.
Now you have to allow yourself to experience what you're experiencing.
And the other interesting thing, I think the show lady said she was a psychologist, but you're using this as an experience in the Hebrew literature. But of course, it's not just Hebrew literature, it's human
Right.
literature that we're talking
Yes. Right. What Judaism did is taking this human experience and in a way saying, like almost like forcing you to go through it, not allowing you to be distracted, not allowing you to say, hey, don't worry about me, I'm fine. And then you never know where it pops up later in a negative way. So no, you're making it, organizing it for you, ritualizing it for you so that you're gonna, in a way, mandating so that you can experience it in a healthy way. Yes.
The idea of mitzvah on behalf of somebody who's passed away is that accrue good deeds both for the doer of the good deeds and on the behalf.
Yes.
It's both at the
Both,
same
sure.
time. And are there some areas, if there's a causal relationship between the good deed and the person who's passed on, example, a person passed on as a scholar, student decides to teach additional people on behalf of the scholar, are there particular things in Judaism that are enumerated as being causally related and therefore of a greater benefit or a greater causality to good deeds?
Right. I haven't seen that it should be more or different, but usually what you would say is that if that was what's important to the person and that's what they would have done, then that's the mitzvah that they would be looking for. So that's what you should be doing. Yeah. But really, any mitzvah would work. So. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you tomorrow, 9:15, Kabbalah and meditation.